Well, thank you to all of you. That was a huge amount of, I hope you'll agree, extraordinarily interesting analysis and information. We've covered an enormously broad canvas here, from the overall fiscal position through spending, tax options, Brexit, and regional inequality. So we could, I'm sure, stay here for a very long time discussing all of that, but we've certainly got half an hour if you want it for questions. So I think there are roving mics. So if you have questions, if you could identify yourself, and we will try and answer them. Start with Polly.
Thank you. Polly Toynbee from The Guardian. What scope is there for shifting some things from the current spending line to the capital spending line, particularly education and skills? If you educate and give skills to someone who hasn't got them, not only does that last the whole of their lifetime, probably longer than a new office block, but also their children and their children's children. Isn't that a really productive investment, and why should it be on the wrong side of the line?
Well, I mean, you're certainly raising an important issue here. There is something arbitrary about what counts at the moment as investment spending as opposed to current spending, and you're absolutely right that investment in education has a long run impact, possibly more than something where you're building a road or building an office block. I think there's a couple of possible answers to that question. One is where you could just decide to change the fiscal rules to allow different sorts of spending not to count against your current budget. Now, that raises the issue that, of course, that would raise, as Ben showed, that would mean debt rising over time. So you need to be pretty confident that this would have a big impact on productivity in the future. You could, so in the end, it's an arbitrary decision about what you count on one side of the line or another. Some people have been talking about, though, something which is sort of related to this, the idea that you look at the public sector balance sheet, so the stuff that the public sector owns. Now, at the moment, most of what counts as capital spending, you build something and that appears in the balance sheet in the way that the human capital you might create doesn't appear in the balance sheet. And I think that is actually one of the arguments against that kind of, one of the several arguments against that sort of approach. But I think the fundamental answer to your question, Polly, is that this is really about where you think fiscal sustainability comes from and what is fiscally sustainable. Even with the current set of rules, financial debt will probably rise over time. If you count more stuff as investment and allow yourself to borrow more, then the debt will rise even faster over time. And you'd have to be more confident than I probably am that you would get that under control in the future, because you've got so much additional growth as a result of that investment, as opposed to simply deferring the difficult decisions, which is at some point you will have to raise the tax burden in order to keep that debt under control. Did you want to add to that, Ben?
Yes. So I agree that at times and in certain instances it can feel like a false distinction, as Paul said, and I don't think education is the only example of that. You could talk about investments in people's health or even their housing and so on, leading to benefits down the line. But that's more really just taking a long-term perspective on what your spending is supposed to achieve. And I think in a lot of these cases, the decision of whether it's classed as current and capital is done on the basis of internationally agreed statistical definitions, and there's very good reason for that, in part just to prevent the government from gaming these things and trying to play and fiddle with the figures to achieve their own arbitrary fiscal rules. And you might see them, if the government was to say, well, we now think schools should be treated as capital spending, so we'll take all that out. That leaves us with 45 billion extra a year to play with. Fantastic. And we've seen governments over the years repeatedly game these things. And I think agreeing on a set of accounting definitions internationally and then sticking to them it might have some costs in the way you outline, but I think overall the benefits probably exceed them.
Right down at the front here.
Thanks. Thanks. Matt Dickinson from the Federation of Small Businesses. Can I ask on entrepreneurs relief, so that average £50,000 saving, we know that a lot of small business owners, particularly at the smaller end, use entrepreneurs relief to help with retirement plans. Do you know kind of offhand how that £50,000 saving compares to the amount that the average employee would gain over their lifetime in terms of tax relief and also contribution from their employer?
No is the short answer. In a lot of cases, I think you're right, it is basically used as a retirement vehicle. And I was less highlighting the £50,000 average as being extraordinary as the fact that three-quarters of it's going to the 5,000 people getting £350,000 each in relief, which does seem pretty extraordinary. Again, the option of saving in a pension is open to those people, though they may need to have the availability of cash in their business. I think some of the problems that are caused by entrepreneurs relief make it hard to justify effectively using it as a vehicle like that. And it's also, again, it's just not a well-targeted relief at encouraging saving, even if it's for pension purposes, because what it ends up doing is giving a bigger tax break to those who get higher returns on their investment rather than for those who put aside a lot. And that doesn't seem to me to be the right way of doing it.
I think it's also worth saying that there's a parallel in one of the things that Stuart didn't have time to go into in much detail, which is the tax relief on a quarter of the pension pot that you take out at retirement or after age 55. That is very concentrated among those with very big pension pots, because it's not capped beyond the scale of the pension pot that you can have, so that you can get £250,000 out entirely tax-free from your pension pot. That is money that has never been taxed because it went in tax-free as well. So one of the things that we think is clearly been a better tax increase on pensions than reducing tax relief on the way in would be to get rid of, or probably more realistically substantially reduce the amount that you can take out entirely tax-free at the end. And I think that is a little bit similar actually to this effectively uncapped amount that you can get in entrepreneurs relief. If you want to target this stuff, then you can target it much better than we do at the moment.
Andrew Woodcock from The Independent. I was interested in the graph which showed the impact of various different trading arrangements on the volume of trade which could be expected between different countries. The Prime Minister is talking about going for either a Canadian-style agreement or an Australian-style agreement, and he says that the UK will prosper under both. I'm just wondering, is it possible from your figures to say something about the likely impact on the volume of trade and on GDP of those two arrangements? And is he correct to say that the UK would prosper under both?
Peter?
The Australia-type deal, I regard that as a euphemism for WTO rules. And there's been various estimates of the impact that kind of agreement would have on UK GDP, ranging from 3% of GDP to 9%, depending on what assumptions you make about the long-run productivity effects of that kind of agreement.
That's a long-run estimate.
This is in the long run. This is not the immediate effects. This is over a long period of time, slow bleed of lower growth, leading to that relative to the growth we would otherwise experience. And there are similar sort of estimates out there for more standard free trade agreements. I think in all these kind of estimates, these are estimates of the trade effects of the New Deal. The purpose of the divergence is for the UK to set its own regulations and to have more regulatory autonomy. The benefits from that are much more inchoate. If I knew the value of what discoveries we make in fintech, if we had reduced regulations on that and people were able to experiment more, I wouldn't be here. I'd be a very rich person instead. And so it's naturally impossible, very difficult to quantify those kinds of gains. But from the trade effects alone, the effects of these kind of divergence is large.
I mean, it follows directly from reducing trade with your biggest trading partner, which those additional frictions would create, that we will, in that sense, as a direct result of that, be economically worse off than we otherwise would be. Now, that could still be defined as prospering, because that's still, that is still consistent with growth. It's just consistent, probably, with a bit less growth than we'd otherwise get. Maybe up the back.
Hi, Liz Martins, HSBC. You've used the Bank of England's growth forecasts, which were particularly gloomy, which may well be completely right, especially if the coronavirus overtakes us all. But the Bank of England's growth forecasts only allow for the September spending increases and nothing on capital spending, nothing from the budget that comes in March. So do you think it's possible that the OBR will actually give you quite a nice, generous multiplier from that will mean the OBR's forecasts are better than the Bank of England's, and therefore the government can actually keep to the current budget rule?
So we do allow for a fairly generous multiplier, as the OBR does for the investment spending that we include from the Conservative Manifesto. It is still entirely possible that the OBR will take a more optimistic view either of the underlying growth or of the effect that that growth will have on the public finances. So, for example, disappointing growth since the referendum has not had as bad an effect on the public finances as we've been used to previously. So it's entirely possible that the hit will be smaller. It's also entirely possible, so we've assumed that the outturn we've had this year, which has been favorable, persists into the forecast horizon. It's entirely possible that that will not happen, and the news will be worse than what we've shown in that presentation. So it could go both ways.
Paul Wallace, I'm a journalist. Given the fact that headline debt does include the Bank of England, is debt actually going to fall over the next 5 years, come what may, given likely increases, say, in investment spending, and also about the geographical distribution of manufacturing jobs and the potential impact from losing the access we have at the moment to EU markets. Does that, you didn't provide an overlay with, I understand why, but you didn't provide an overlay with the electoral red wall effect, and I wonder whether, to what extent they do coincide.
Isabel, would headline debt fall if we got to 3% of...
Headline debt would still be falling. I mean, the question is if that is really treating that commitment in an honest way. So we think the more meaningful measure to look at is stripping out the Bank of England, but you'd have to try fairly hard to get headline debt to rise over the Parliament.
We might get some quite big efforts, but underlying debt would certainly be rising. Peter, have you tried to
I haven't correlated with any kind of vote shares or political outcomes, and even if I did, the aggregate outcome in the region is not necessarily how the people affected would have voted.
But you can see where those places were. I mean, there were, I don't know if they were the same constituencies, but they were in that part of England and Wales where a lot of votes changed. So there's a woman up there.
Ruth Gregory from Capital Economics. I was just another question for Isabel, really, on that 3.5 billion that you've assumed on the outturns persisting. Is that really driven by, the strength of the labour market, really, and the resilience that we've seen there, and that persisting into the later years of the forecast?
That's a 3.5 billion better turnout than expected
in the target year because of
I think it's a little bit too early to say what it's driven by, as this is sort of the almost real-time data as it's coming out. I would certainly think that it has something to do with the strength of the labour market, but I think we're going to need a little bit of a longer delay to really interpret. Interpretation is more backwards looking than that.
Yeah.
Am I right that we've persistently done a bit better than expected given growth over the last few years?
Yes, this was driven in part by the labour market. This was also after the referendum. A lot of the disappointing growth has been because the bit of GDP that's done really poorly is business investment, which we tax lightly. So in that way, it's sort of good news disguising potentially bad news further down the line. So in that sense, it's not really clear if it will persist. The OBR's forecast evaluation report goes in lots and lots of detail through all the different tax heads to explain how the outturn has arisen in the last couple of years. So another couple of years, I'm sure they'll be able to tell us exactly where the 3.5 billion came from.
Yeah, but the public finances do well when businesses don't invest, but only in the short run. Were there any other questions?
The questions over here.
So was there? I can't see. Oh, there. Sorry.
Thank you, Sheila Page, ODI. Taking the last two presentations together, have you been able to use the projections for the effects by industry of Brexit to do anything on projecting forward the regional inequalities?
So as part of the green budget, when we had the sector level impacts I showed you earlier, we sort of looked across regions on the basis of employment shares and looked at which regions were expected to be most at risk, and it turned out to be places like the West Midlands. We didn't make so much of a song and dance about it because there are a lot of uncertainties there, particularly when you drill down into individual locations where it might depend on all our estimates are industry level, but it might depend on decisions made by an individual plant or an individual business. And the other thing is there is uncertainty about the costs involved for different sectors. How big are the new barriers facing the finance industry and how costly are they going to be, for example? You make different reasonable assumptions about that. London can zip up and down the table. So we weren't 100% confident in the kind of ranking of it. But it does look like what we were more confident in saying, though, was that it's the kind of workers who are employed in manufacturing, who have fewer qualifications, who are in local labour markets where there aren't so many other outside opportunities. That is definitely an at-risk group, and that's what we thought was most important to highlight.
And I mean, looking at kind of the sort of commuting patterns you see in the kind of types of jobs in different areas, you'd expect it to be those sort of slightly more peripheral manufacturing towns that are hardest hit by this. If you're sort of a town near a city, you see already kind of more commuting from those areas. It's likely that commuting is easy from those areas, more opportunities nearby. And if you're kind of a manufacturing town further from a major city, it'll be a bigger issue. And I think this kind of like speaks to something that's not really been kind of shown in my presentation so far, is that there's sort of a difference between, if you like, kind of the incomes and earnings of people at the moment and the opportunities looking ahead. I think that's something I want to look at in more detail kind of going forward, how these might affect it, but also how kind of other things are affecting the opportunities of the next generation as well.
I mean, clearly the overall story here is one of significant risks. If there is a concentrated impact in certain industries, and those are particularly concentrated, actually often in the sorts of regions that have suffered in the 1980s particularly, and one of the things that I think comes very directly out of what David showed is that these effects can be very long-lasting in terms of the earnings and well-being of people in those areas.
Kevin Langford, what's the biggest opportunity he's going to miss or indeed take in relation to climate change in the budget?
Well, so I mean, Stuart mentioned fuel duties. It is. I mean, there's a certain dissonance, isn't there, between a government committed to net zero and a government which has chopped 6 billion off fuel duties in the last decade and will presumably continue to take to reduce fuel duties. The point about getting to that target of net zero is that there is a colossal amount that needs to be done in terms of moving to electric vehicles, moving away from gas central heating, changing the way we use land. Still more to do to create a lot more renewable energy. The Treasury is in the process of a really quite big review of the question of how to pay for that transition to net zero, which is due to report in the early autumn before the COP meeting later in the autumn. My guess is that the Chancellor will therefore not say an enormous amount in this budget, and we may find that the budget in the autumn will say a lot more, because that will come after the period of that a really quite substantial and really quite important and serious review that is being led by Treasury at the moment. So I don't know what they will and won't do this time round, but if I had to bet, I would bet that it will be the autumn budget, which is the big green one, rather than the one we're going to see in a couple of weeks. Right at the back.
Hi, Faisal Islam, BBC. I just wondered what you thought of what the EU negotiator David Frost said specifically about these sorts of studies of trade. I'll just quote a couple of quotes from his speech last week, where he said that it's not trade that drives productivity, it's productivity that drives trade, and that these sorts of analyses are for developing countries, essentially, and shouldn't really apply to the UK. And he also said they assume the smallest possible impacts for regulatory change, but other factors will outweigh the one-off costs of increase in customs. I mean, is there any evidence in any of the literature for what David Frost said?
So I think with regard to the paper I took those estimates from, I think none of those criticisms would apply. So, I mean, it obviously includes developed countries in the sample. I mean, you saw the EU single market as one of the deals there. I mean, their empirical approach is to look at how much trade increases when these agreements are in place versus times when they're not, allowing for, you know, trade to grow in different countries in different ways across time. And there's nothing assumed about non-tariff barriers in those estimates. They are just estimates of the effects those different trade agreements have on trade between different countries. So, you know, rather than anything being assumed, those are empirical estimates of the effects of those kind of non-tariff barriers. So I guess that would be my answer.
Is it fair to say that all of these estimates are taken off changes which deepen trade links and improve trade agreements, and actually there just isn't much evidence anywhere in the world of a country doing what we're doing, which is to kind of move in the other direction?
It is true. It is, well, so to be fair, it is true to say, yes, as you say, that there may be asymmetries in some of these effects. Most of the world has been integrating over time, and that's why we have estimates of trade integration, not disintegration. And the estimates of disintegration might be the unwinding of like colonial relationships and things like that, which will mainly be about developing countries. So I think I would grant, and that is, you know, potentially significant.
I think Peter's not saying that we have a colonial relationship with the EU.
and just a quick follow-up. If you connect two of the different presentations, I think a similar question was asked. What would a levelling up trade strategy look like? I'm going to presume that your equations would show a more aligned relationship for the Northeast and the Midlands, for example, is what the numbers would show would deliver a better GDP outcome in those regions. But tell me.
So So I guess it's back to the point of, we're a majority services economy, but most of trade and most of the tradable, most of trade is in goods, and most of those tradable industries are in these particular locations. So you might think, if you're particularly worried about particularly harsh outcomes for particular groups, then it would be those kind of agreements that facilitate goods trade that might be more important. It's really difficult to disentangle what aspects of the trade agreements that they are, because of course trade in goods and trade in services reinforce each other. There's input-output links that means that service suppliers are connected to goods industries. I guess it's fair to say that the sharper end of geographical inequality is mediated by reducing particularly those barriers for those tradable sectors.
And on that, I think if you look at the particular local areas where sort of productivity tends to be lowest and earnings tend to be lowest, it's often those areas where, say, food manufacturing is a particularly important industry. So Lincolnshire, for example, has quite high manufacturing share and has quite low productivity, and a lot of that is food manufacturing. And the other kind of notable thing is that the sort of these areas that have seen these sort of big declines in productivity and earnings in the 1980s, that hasn't been continuing. That sort of happened. It hasn't been continuing on an ongoing basis, but neither have they made it up. Those areas are often sort of on this sort of as well as being sort of Lincolnshire, other food manufacturing areas, this sort of spine sort of between the cities in the Midlands and the North. So that's another sort of area which sort of has low productivity, low earnings compared to the sort of areas around the bigger cities, and also has a lot of manufacturing as well. So I think there are links between, sort of dealing at manufacturing, especially for certain sectors like food, and these sort of left behind places, the areas that have struggled from the 80s onwards.
I think the broad conclusion I would draw is that we often sort of look at, the UK has 88% services as Peter showed, but if you're really worried about levelling up in a trade deal, actually there is a good case for focusing 88% of your time on the goods bit and not on the services bit. I'm not saying that services don't matter; they clearly do matter. But if you're worried about levelling up, then you really, really, really want to focus on the manufacturing, on the goods side of it.
But to be clear, that's the exact opposite of the political argument. It's like people in these areas want a harder Brexit because, you see where I'm going with this. It's intriguing, isn't it?
It is intriguing. Do we have any? One over there, is it?
Yeah, this guy over here.
Okay. So we got Donald first.
Thank you, Donald Roy, long-standing member of IFS, but with no affiliation I intend to admit to at the moment for these purposes. One issue that strikes me, looking beyond the immediate fiscal year, is the question of how much fiscal headroom there might be to increase tariff revenues in a situation either where increased tariffs are consistent with trade agreements, or where possibly a failure to negotiate effective trade agreements results in a high level of tariffs by default. Has any work yet been done on that?
I don't think we've made any estimates of potential tariff income, is that right?
Back in last year's Green Budget, when we were analysing a no-deal scenario, which has now been averted, we took an estimate that the OBR's Fiscal Risk Report had made of tariff revenue. It's a bit tricky because obviously if you introduce tariffs, then trade is going to change, so the base of what you're taxing is going to change. It's going, in this case, which was of course a more severe case, but Peter will be more able to speak to intermediate case. It was completely dwarfed by the economic impact, so the tariff revenue really didn't make much of a difference at all.
Yes, so I think the OBR had estimates of tariff revenue, but they assumed fixed composition of imports, so the imports weren't sensitive at all to what tariffs were. Which
Do you remember the scale of those numbers at all?
So I think current tariff revenue is about 3 billion. Yeah.
So it was 7, I think.
You know more about this than...
We're not sure.
I think the tariff revenue would be higher than the tariff, well, the increase would be higher than the current amount we get, because a lot of the goods that currently we get from the EU are the sort of higher tariff ones, like food imports, etc. So take the 3 billion and sort of don't double it, sort of treble it, I think is sort of the right order of magnitude of what they had.
I think it was a 7 billion impact, but
Yeah.
don't quote me on it.
Okay, that sort of order of magnitude, but dwarfed by the economic effects.
Last time, there was a strong policy discussion about leaving the EU, which was in the 1980s. There were people who were advocating a situation of an average 7% tariff on manufacturing. Presumably, that is probably somewhat out of the range of what everybody is currently comfortable.
I would think so. Was there
in case it needs saying, we may end up with tariffs because of how the negotiation goes, but you certainly shouldn't look to deliberately raise revenue from tariffs. Restricting trade is not a good way to raise revenue.
Paul Hudson. I shall bore Paul Johnson to death by replaying my usual CD. Thanks for the usual 5-star standard, unvarying from meeting to meeting, in fact, for your presentations. I'm most grateful to. I think you've been particularly courageous, in fact, in embarking on your attempts at predictions, given there are important elements in the government who are not well known for having strong concentration spans, let alone being consistent, and perhaps wouldn't even understand a balance sheet even if it were written in Greek numerals. My main question, I think, is directed to David Phillips. It's mainly a statistical rather than an economic point. I think most people understand by the term earnings, wages plus overtime. The question I'm going to ask is motivated by the fact that there are a lot of the people who are pensioners are a larger part of the population. Emeritus Professor Malcolm Sawyer of Leeds and I are both academic pensioners. He thinks that pensioners are rentiers. I think they're people who are in receipt of deferred earnings. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know whether the IFS has a collective view of which of those is correct, but I don't know whether it would make a significant difference to your analysis.
So I think this issue about kind of the incomes of pensions is actually kind of an important point to raise in these sort of comparisons across regions. So I should say the earnings figures I showed are just earnings for those in work, and they are after the employer contributions to pensions, but before any employee contributions. That's how the kind of wages are measured for this survey. The income measures I showed, though, they're for all households, including pensioners, and therefore the pensions income that pensioners get would be captured in those figures. And I think one interesting question, we want to kind of dig into this a bit further, is that underlying some of these kind of like headline trends in average earnings across regions, average earnings across local authorities, average incomes across local authorities, is that actually we know that demographics are quite different across local authorities and across regions, and they've been changing differently. So the fact we haven't seen places like the Midlands towns, the coastal communities, sort of further falling behind areas, well, actually, I'd expect those areas to be doing quite well and actually catching up, because they're actually areas where the population is quite old, where the population is getting older, and we know more generally older people will be doing better than younger people. So one thing I want to dig into is when we actually look at, control for the demographics, look at how young people are doing in these areas, are we seeing a different trend than we see if we look at the whole population, which is what these figures are showing. So I think that's a really important point you raised. On this issue about whether you define, pensions as deferred compensation or as sort of, volunteer income, I think the way we treat it in the tax system is effectively as deferred compensation. You don't get taxed on the kind of on the kind of contributions, you get taxed on the way out. I think that's a good way for us to treat it as a tax system. I think it's a good way to think about it.
That's probably quite a good place to end. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you particularly to my colleagues for, as I said, a phenomenally rich set of presentations, and do feel free to come and hassle them for the next few minutes if you've got any further questions. But thank you all so much for coming, and we look very much forward to the 11th of March to see what will actually happen.